What's going on, everybody? Thank you all so much for tuning into this live stream segment of MCSC. We have a very special segment today. Today, I will be debating Robbie Martin. Many of you may know him as the co-host of Media Roots. He is the brother of Abby Martin. They do some awesome work together. Really, the whole Martin family seems to be doing some pretty amazing work, which we greatly appreciate. And we're going to be talking about whether or not Tulsi is a legitimate anti-war candidate. And so, Robbie, if you don't mind introducing yourself, letting people know like what you do, where you generally stand on the political spectrum, and basically what you would like to see happen in 2020, if you have an idea at this point, just from your personal perspective.
Well, thanks for having me on, Niko. Yeah, so I have been hosting a podcast with my sister Abby Martin for about 10 years. It sort of started as a podcast focused on U.S. foreign policy, the eroding of civil liberties after 9/11, and we were heavily critical of the Obama administration pretty much from the very beginning from a left progressive perspective. And, from there, Abby got a show on Russia Today called Breaking the Set. She did a lot of work there for about 3 years. And we're still doing the podcast, but since then, I have made a documentary film series that a lot of your viewers would probably enjoy. Just a little plug there for my documentary.
What's it called?
It's called A Very Heavy Agenda, and it covers how the neoconservatives since 9/11 essentially switched from fear-mongering the American public about Muslims and terrorists to Russia, and how the neocons, the same ones who were responsible for a lot of the Bush-era policy, are the same group that pushed us into this new Cold War 2.0 paradigm. So it's a 3-part documentary. It's really long, but I think it adds a lot of important context to the whole Russiagate debate. So if anyone's interested in sort of debunking Russiagate or deconstructing that, I highly recommend they check that out.
That's some good stuff, man. I mean, I talk about that all the time. And in my opinion, it seems to me to be clearly obvious. Like they have to have a boogeyman. And it's in every era, I would imagine, even dating back to the early 1900s, the boogeyman was Germany. Even when Germany wasn't really the boogeyman, but it was more because of them being economic competition that could potentially stand in the way of a U.S./Great Britain empire. And so, I've noticed that too, that basically it was Muslims at one point, and now it's transitioned into Russians, which, by the way, I'm sure you would probably agree, the way that they're going about dealing with the rhetoric behind all this Russiagate nonsense is coming off, in my opinion, as a bit xenophobic. I living in Miami, I've talked to a lot of Russians here, and a lot of them are even hesitant to tell people that they're Russian because of just how they've been demonized for no other reason outside of being Russian.
Oh, that's absolutely believable. I mean, I even get kind of like guffaws and gasps from people sometimes when I explain who my sister is, who she worked for, that I've gone in Russia Today studios. I mean, there's people in the Bay Area who are sort of liberal or, pretty progressive who find that shocking and kind of alarming to them since all this hysteria has started. So I've experienced it on a different level, but I'm sure there's a lot of xenophobia embedded in it. I mean, there was a lot of xenophobia as well embedded in the original Cold War rhetoric that was during the Red Scare. So it's kind of, it definitely mirrors that in a lot of ways. The dehumanization of Russian people, essentially.
Yeah, 100% agree. And it's sad because it seems like it's worse now. Back then, I mean, it was kind of like crazy, but like, I get it. We just got out of a war. Tensions were high. Like Truman it was Truman who violated the Yalta Conference agreements. And so it at least made sense back then, I guess, even though it was kind of over the top and crazy. But now it's kind of like out of nowhere, it's completely and totally predicated on a lie. Like the bigotry we've seen towards Russia and the animosity we've directed towards them is totally based on a lie. Even though it keeps getting debunked over and over and over and over again, people just kind of keep on like, they're going to keep doubling down. And even Elizabeth Warren the other day, while talking about impeachment, said that she basically was using there's a collusion problem that we really haven't really addressed. It's like, no, it's been addressed. It's literally been addressed. Okay. But you don't want to accept it. Before it was wait till the investigation concluded. Now the investigation is concluded. We don't really believe all the investigation anyway. We're they say that, well, we have to impeach because Mueller said it's our duty, but then Mueller also said there was no collusion, and if they could prove obstruction, or they, or excuse me, what do you say? If they could say he was innocent, then they would. Like, that's not your job. Like, I don't know where you get that from, but it's all over the place with the logic. But ultimately, it seems like they're going to try to demonize Russia no matter what.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was in some of those Peter Strzok leaked text messages that really revealed the level of xenophobia that these people are really operating on. I mean, I don't remember his exact quote, but he said something in private text messages, which is something along the lines of, those dirty, cheating, thieving, lying Russians. They always lie. They always cheat. The way he was talking about him,
yeah,
it's kind of like he was in Rocky IV. I mean, so it's kind of, this is the mentality you're operating on for sure.
Yep. All right. So, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I'll let you open the floor. So everybody at this point should not be a secret. I support Tulsi Gabbard. That's who I endorse for president. Many people know that I was like probably the most well-known Bernie bro back in the day, just because of the activism side and the organization side, and then eventually the journalism side. But I have endorsed Tulsi. The reason I have endorsed her is because of her anti-war stances. But not only that, it seems that she actually understands how consent is manufactured, is willing to challenge that. Robbie does feel that there's potentiality for Tulsi to not be the candidate that I or others may think, which is always interesting coming from somebody who I would consider a pretty progressive person, because it's not an argument you hear posed from legitimate progressives very often. So I'll let you have the floor. What is it about Tulsi's platform or her rhetoric, or just about her career, that you feel disqualifies her, or may disqualify her, I should say, as an anti-war candidate?
Well, I should just start by saying that the word disqualify is pretty strong. So, I think to different people, what defines someone as anti-war could mean different things. People on the left have different ideas what that means. People on the right do. So I'm more assessing her sort of foreign policy credentials, her anti-war credentials, from the same standard that we've been used to of what an anti-war politician from previous Republican and Democrat primaries have put out as their positions before.
Okay.
So one of my biggest problems with her anti-war rhetoric or her anti-war platform is that she does make a distinction between U.S. regime change wars, and she's spoken very strongly out against those. But she has said, while she is a dove on regime change wars, she is a hawk on terrorism. Mm-hmm. It's not just that quote alone that bothered me or even piqued my curiosity about what she meant. I started to look into her other statements about the war on terror, recent interviews with Glenn Greenwald and other people asking her to explain and break down what that means. And what I found is that she really hasn't broken down exactly what that means, or how she defines being hawkish in the war on terror. Like, if that means more military force, more drone strikes, it's not exactly clear. But what I have found is that when you compare her rhetoric to that of previous, let's just pick two examples of two previous self-identified anti-war candidates, Dennis Kucinich and Ron Paul, who's not a progressive, he was a Republican. Both of those candidates.
Hold on, Ron Paul, the libertarian, or Rand Paul?
Sorry, Ron Paul. Yes.
Okay.
Ron.
Okay. Got you. I was wondering, because you said he's a Republican. I was like, hold on, that's crossing both of the thing. But I got you. Rand Paul.
Yeah, Rand is too much of a wild card. He switches his positions too much. So Ron Paul and Dennis Kucinich remain pretty ideologically consistent, and both of them folded into their anti-war platforms, even when they were both just in Congress. The idea that the war on terror was fundamentally a flawed concept, and that it actually breached legal norms, that it looked at the entire globe as a battlefield, that we have the right, or that America has the right or duty to, quote unquote, defend itself by going into what country it chooses to attack whatever terrorist it identifies and chooses, regardless of providing proof or not. The United States has essentially been given authority to see the entire planet as a battlefield, without defining the borders or other countries' sovereignty. So I guess the point I'm trying to make, if I've gone off a little bit roundabout way here, is that I believe Tulsi, when you really break down what being a hawk on the war on terror means, and because she doesn't fundamentally disagree with the framework on terror, it actually
so I do want to say that part is actually, she does fundamentally disagree with the quote unquote war on terror. She actually speaks about the war on terror in the same way she speaks about the war on drugs. But go ahead. I want to let you finish your conclusion before I just wanted to clarify that part.
I'm definitely curious to hear what you said about that. So, and these are all things that to me define what supporting the general framework of the war on terror means. And you will have to tell me, or other people will have to tell me, if she actually agrees with some of these things, because I couldn't find evidence if she agrees with them or disagrees with them. So, for example, I know that she supports closing Gitmo. But one of the primary things that defines the war on terror paradigm is that foreign fighters in these battlefields are not necessarily privy to POW status and can be defined as enemy combatants, putting them in a general sense in a legal black hole. So while I know that she wants to close Gitmo, I haven't heard from her what she wants to do with the prisoners in Gitmo. Like, if she believes they should be given a trial, if she believes that other people in these battlefields in the war on terror should be given a trial, that's not clear. And even just the general concept of, she does strongly oppose regime change war, she says, but I haven't heard her talk about the legal ramifications of doing drone strikes or targeted assassinations or even Delta Force raids in other countries where we haven't been given permission by that country's government to go in and kill so-called terrorists.
Okay.
And I think that that's something that, obviously Dennis Kucinich and Ron Paul, were strongly opposed to that paradigm, that we can essentially do whatever we want. If we say there's a terrorist over there, we need to go get him.
Mm-hmm.
So I could break down further what being pro war on terror means to me, but I am curious to hear what how she has opposed it.
So appreciate it. That's a pretty good way of framing it. Now I do want to deal with the overall frame. We can go from macro to micro. Now the dove versus hawk statement. I think I should probably frame that correctly, because she is a dove, but when it comes to terrorism, she is a hawk. I understand why that sounds like, because of the way we've heard it used by not only Republicans but Democrats in the past. Why it sounds like you have to be on the attack, you have to be on the offensive. However, based off of the legislation that Tulsi's introduced and a lot of her rhetoric, it actually seems to be the opposite. I think when she says hawk, she means she wants to be diligent in ensuring that terrorism, whether or not it's, quote unquote rebels or something funded and aided and abetted by the United States, she doesn't want any of it. And so evidence of this would be, instead of introducing legislation to go to war somewhere else, she introduced legislation to stop arming terrorists. Like, quite literally, that's what the legislation was called. And then she also introduced legislation that was called the Stop Financing Terrorism Act. As you could probably imagine, you don't have to guess how many people voted in favor of it. But she did introduce this legislation, and this is the legislation that she actually introduced in 2017. It didn't get a lot of media traction, but it's because it does it precisely what you would expect it to do. It disallows from the United States and any of its allies, and also asks to hold accountable the allies of the United States. It disallows us from funding terrorism in any way. It disallows us from using our weapons to arm terrorists. So what it seems to be to me is that when she says she's a hawk on terror, that she's a hawk on the idea of terrorism, no matter how it comes about. And the idea is, or excuse me, in her actions seem to be that she will battle it, but not with weapons, which seems to be a kind of a consistent theme with her, because it's like she always says, when I can't meet with Assad, if he's an evil guy, supposedly, if I can't meet with even Bibi Netanyahu, who actually is an evil guy, or if I can't meet with Putin, and we have animosity and friction with all these countries, at the end of the day, the only alternative is war. And she would prefer to always practice peace if at all possible. Now, as far as the rhetoric from Ron Paul and Dennis Kucinich, who are both anti-war, I think that both of them would agree, which is why Ron Paul has given such glowing reviews of Tulsi already, that she is the most hated candidate by both sides of the establishment for a reason. And I'm sure you understand how the political game goes. the candidate who's the least of a threat gets elevated usually, and the candidate who is the biggest threat, they either get blacked out by the media or they are thoroughly smeared. Now, it's interesting in Tulsi's case because obviously her whole thing, you know, in the eyes of the media has been foreign policy, foreign policy, foreign policy. They say she's not a threat. They say she's only polling at 1% in most polls, but yet you've seen smear article after smear article after smear article about her. When challenged on this, oftentimes they get dragged through the dirt, but they smeared her as a Russian asset. MSNBC smeared her as a Russian asset out the gate. Why would you do that if this is the woman who's supposedly like a quote unquote sleeper cell? You know, just, you know, that's hyperbolic, but that's basically the counter argument for Tulsi is like, oh, she's secretly pro-war and Islamophobic, but the truth of the matter is, it seems to be that she's actually the complete and total opposite. And not only is she the opposite, but like when George Stephanopoulos tried to get kind of say, well, do you agree with Trump on Iran though? Like, because, you know, the mainstream, they want war with Iran. That's great for them. However, Tulsi said straight up, nah, the Trump administration doesn't have credibility. And he was like, what do you mean by that? She was like, well, they're making up lies to manufacture consent for a war with Iran. Now, she was the first, well, she's the only one who's ever used that type of terminology as a presidential candidate that is actually has a pretty large platform. And I would say in modern day, like not maybe in the 80s and the 90s, but like in contemporary, in the contemporary political arena, she's the first one who's ever done something like that. She was also the first one to come out against war in Iran without being prompted for it. She was the first one to speak out for Julian Assange before it was just a matter of free press. It was a matter of what Julian Assange did was not wrong. I mean, especially just merely acting as a publisher. And she said that it was political retaliation for exposing war crimes. So I think that would probably be best if you could like give me specific examples outside of the Dove and the Hawk thing where you believe that she may be more pro-war than what she is leading us to believe. Because when we're looking at legislation, she's there. Like she's already introduced it. She's willing to introduce it again. When we're looking at whether she spoke out against the war in Venezuela or potential war in Venezuela or the coup in Venezuela before anybody and codified it correctly. She spoke out against Iran first. Obviously, she questioned the chemical attacks in Syria very early on, along with Rand Paul. I'm sure you remember that. And then she, even when she was defending Ilhan Omar, she was very blatant when she said they're smearing Ilhan Omar not just because she's Muslim, but because she's anti-war. So like this seems to be a pretty consistent theme with her, where she's not only is she anti-war, but she's out ahead of the game. She's out ahead of everybody when it comes to being anti-war, which is why I think people like Ron Paul and Jill Stein even have kind of grown an affinity to her. So like, do you have other examples where you think that the rhetoric isn't really matching what we see as an anti-war candidate?
Yes. I mean, well, I should say that I'm not making the argument that she is more pro-war necessarily than she's letting on, or that and you mentioned earlier that, you know, a lot of people are attacking her, saying that she's secretly Islamophobic or that she's actually really a hawk sort of, and she's presenting herself as a dove. I'm not necessarily making that argument. That what I'm trying to say is that she hasn't been pinned down, and this is something I didn't really get to mention when I opened up, is that I believe she needs to be pinned down, and she needs to clarify exactly on potentially dozens of points of what define what the war on terror means. So, for example, let me just give you one example of how Glenn Greenwald, in an interview, gave her the opportunity to clarify the hawk and dove statement. He asked her on May 9th, 2019, tell me if you could, in which you describe yourself as a hawk, do you support the prongs of the war on terror that haven't been about regime change, like drone assassinations, even of American citizens, Guantanamo? What is your hawkishness when it comes to the war on terror? This is her answer. She said, Al-Qaeda attacked us on 9/11, killing thousands of Americans. We have continued to see the threat that is posed by terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. This is not a war that we chose, but it is a threat that continues, and we can just not turn our backs and pretend it doesn't exist. So when I say I'm a hawk on fighting against terrorism, it is against these groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Our national security is important. Keeping the American people safe is the #1 job that the president has. And then when Glenn Greenwald tries to press her specifically on because she basically didn't really answer his question, because he was asking her, what aspects do you mean more hawkish? The only example she pulls out to try to explain what she means is the same one that you did earlier, that she has tried to propose a bill and try to get a bill passed, the Stop Funding Terrorists Act. But that doesn't really answer Greenwald's question. And the general question is, what exactly does she mean? He gave her 3 examples: drone assassinations of American citizens, 2 examples, and Guantanamo. And I've heard that she opposes Guantanamo, but
she does. She's staunchly opposed to Guantanamo.
But going back to my earlier point, one of the fundamental problems with her not fundamentally undermining the entire framework of the war on terror and sort of passively promoting it, or even sometimes, directly promoting it, is that we don't really know where she stands on the issue of like enemy combatants. So if she's against closing, or if she's against Gitmo being open, what does that mean for the prisoners who are in there now? What does that mean for any enemy, quote unquote, enemy combatant that was picked up on the battlefield? Does she believe they should be given a fair trial? Does she believe they should be held indefinitely?
So I think that's like more of a semantics discussion, because I think you would have to handle it case by case, or have a sit down discussion about where they come from. And I don't think that she literally just has not had that discussion yet. And no other presidential candidate, whether they call themselves anti-war or not, has had this discussion. So I think that it would be a great discussion to have, but I think that closing Gitmo down in general is a bigger discussion, which is why, and it's kind of important to even make that, to normalize that discussion, rather than focusing on the minutia of it at the time, because we haven't even seen it doesn't look like Gitmo's closing anytime soon. So I can't really argue like what she would say if Gitmo closed, because I don't even know what I would say in that regard, because I would have to hear case by case and go into the, like I said, I'll have to go into the minutia of what these prisoners did and why they're there, and if they're even there legitimately. There's that discussion as well. So now I can't say that the whole I'm actions, right? She is very much so about the protection of the American people, and she makes that very clear. But this is also the same woman who said, because I know you may not have liked the way she answered that question, but this is the same woman who said she joined the military on the lie, basically discussing the war, how the war on terror started, on Joe Rogan's podcast. I don't know if you've heard it yet, but I would strongly encourage you to listen to it. And she literally says this verbatim: I joined the military based on a lie. Referencing the war in Iraq, referencing Afghanistan, talking about the fact that Al-Qaeda was funded by Saudi Arabia, and yet we've never even really dealt with Saudi Arabia the way we should have. And then it seems like, once again, even when her rhetoric may not be spruced up in a way that sounds pretty and anti-war-ish, her actions always seem to mimic what you and I would consider to be an anti-war candidate. She gets to the root causes of a lot of these issues. We're not having this discussion really if Tulsi gets that legislation passed and it gets signed by Trump, or both of those pieces of legislation. You get what I'm saying? Like, we're not even worried about the war on terror, because the war on terror probably would end, because we're the ones who created the damn war on terror to begin with. So it's hard for me if her rhetoric, or excuse me, if her legislation didn't, it just substantially backs the idea of her anti-war platform, that it's so much so that it's hard for me to see like little rhetorical hiccups or slip-ups, which I think a lot of people have, especially when they're being put on the spot regularly, just kind of like part of the game. And she doesn't do prompted questions. Like, I think there's a part of her that doesn't want to come off seeming weak in that particular interview with Glenn Greenwald. And she wants to acknowledge, because I acknowledge, and I'm anti-war as hell, Al-Qaeda is real. But she also acknowledges Al-Qaeda is real because we make them real. And because of that, the threat of them is still real. The threat of ISIS is still real. We can't just ignore them. But she tries to deal with it in a way that just removes power, rather than trying to exert the United States power to try and stamp them out. That's what it seems like her angle is mostly. And I don't know if, I wish I could remember. It was about Yemen, actually. It was about Yemen, and she gave a speech. It was about the Yemen vote. And she was going into detail and breaking down how we give money to Saudi Arabia, and then Saudi Arabia in turn funds terrorism, and then they place proxies wherever we tell them to. if you're not anti-war, then you're not having that conversation. If you're not on the team of peace in general, and if you're not on the team of truth, you're not having that conversation. But Tulsi is the only one who's had that conversation, which is why I tend to obviously lean more towards the, not only is she the anti-war candidate, but like she's the most anti-war candidate we may have had, at least that has a chance to win since Ron Paul. You get what I'm saying? So,
yeah. Well, I just wanted to correct something you said earlier. I wasn't pointing out, her answer to show that she, hiccuped or gave like a necessarily like a really bad answer. The reason I read that answer back is because she doesn't directly answer Greenwald's question. He gave her two things: Gitmo and targeted drone assassination of American citizens. The point I was trying to make is that she has left a lot of these questions open-ended. We don't know where she stands on a lot of the fundamental aspects of what the war on terror means.
But I feel like with the Gitmo prisoners, that's not like a fundamental thing. I still think that's like a semantics discussion that has to be hashed out on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, so
how would you answer that question if you were in her position as an anti-war progressive? Like, how would you specifically answer that question in a reasonable time frame in an interview like that?
Well, I mean, I would have probably been able to point to a few examples of I mean, if she's more hawkish, I would think that as a candidate running for office, she would have some examples in her back pocket specifically of what that means to her. But I mean, to me, so like, for example, we don't even know if she's against the idea of preemptive warfare. So she says she's
she's strongly, that's like half of her speeches are like, she despises the idea of going in and attacking anyone unprovoked. Like, she does not believe in that.
But see, I haven't seen any evidence of that, because she believes that we should be allowed to kill terrorists in other countries if they pose a threat to us, whatever that means. That can be defined by anybody in power in the U.S. government. They can say that group poses a threat. We're allowed to go into that country and murder them, American citizens.
When has she said that?
No, I'm not saying she has said that directly.
Oh.
Is that she has not made it clear if she disagrees with the ability for the United States to be able to conduct war like that. Because let's face it, the war on terror is war. I mean, you are going into another country, launching bombs at someone on the ground, whether it's one person or a group of militants or a whole army. That is a form of war. So I don't know. The point I'm trying to make is that a lot of these things, to me, are open-ended. And I have tried to do a lot of research on her actual quotes. I've watched a lot of her speeches in the last few years, and I haven't been able to pin her down on a lot of these fundamentals of what defines what the war on terror is.
So if you can't find anything that basically says that here in the bowl, other than me saying it in the legislation, like, have you been able to find an evidence that shows a pattern of her advocating for just going after people, like, based off of nothing other than they may be a security threat? Because it seems like her saying going after people in other countries just because we feel like it, like, that is a threat to security. That's what I have heard her say time and time again. So do you have like examples of a pattern that she's established of advocating for going into these countries to attack specific people, regardless of whether or not they're sovereign and, we should be there?
I mean, not specific individuals. I mean, I know that she is, she has definitely advocated for, and this is not a surprising thing, the bombing and U.S. airstrikes on ISIS and al-Nusra and al-Qaeda affiliated groups in Syria and Iraq. I'm fairly certain she has supported that, but in terms of
when would that way, you have to point me. Do you have like a relative idea when that was? Because she's pretty staunchly against any type of action in Syria at this point.
Well, there are tweets that she has made advocating for the sort of patting Trump on the back for eventually bombing Syria. She praised Russia's bombing campaign of Syria against ISIS.
Now, I can see her praising Russia's bombing campaign. I can't see that. I don't know. Like I said, I can't point to that specifically, but that's because based off of her knowledge and what we already know in the international community, Russia's actually trying to bomb Syria. Like, with Russia's been involved, they've been able to push the rebels out. And I do want to clarify from her perspective. She explained in an interview that we actually did with her. The one thing that she learned when she went to Syria is that the opposition that we think is the opposition isn't actually the opposition. The real opposition has peaceful disagreements with the quote unquote Assad regime, but they're not violent. Both the Assad regime and the actual opposition don't like the rebels, and they are not happy about the United States being in Syria, whereas Russia being in Syria, whenever we kind of like pull back the reins, actual progress is made in that regard. And so, but I haven't really seen her cheer on Trump for bombing Russia. I saw her specifically tweet out that the president should not, and she's actually introducing legislation to literally, I think in a week, to stop the president from being able to make unilateral decisions like that. So like, I don't, and that's actually one of the things that made me start leaning towards her in 2017, because like she was the one who got Trump to pull the CIA out of Syria after that meeting. Obviously, as you know, subsequently she was immediately banned from from being in the Oval Office. But she's never, not that I've seen, praised Trump for bombing Syria in any capacity.
Yeah, I think she was more from what I remember the tweet, she was more praising the bombing, the idea that ISIS was finally being bombed in airstrikes. And I can't remember the exact details, but she has tweeted about that. But no, I mean, I cannot point to specific, like if we're talking about specific examples, terrorists, quote unquote terrorists have been killed in drone strikes or targeted before, like Anwar al-Awlaki. I'm not sure where she stands on that. And it would be worth, I really do believe that it's important for someone from the left who can interview her to kind of have her go through all these things issue by issue, especially the issues that I'm trying to break down of what, defines what the war on terror means. Because in my opinion, we honestly don't know. All we can go by is that she seems to differentiate strongly between, being very anti-regime change wars, but at the same time being very willing and even hawkish, in her own words, towards terrorism. So we need to really define exactly what that means. And I think, to me, it's kind of alarmingly undefined right now. It's confusing. And I would also argue
that's what I don't feel like it's that confusing, because it'd be different if she was. So there are a lot of candidates that are talking, like, for example, just so if we're leaving from the war framing, Elizabeth Warren swears to God she has plans. I have no fucking idea what these plans are. We have no idea because she hasn't introduced anything. And in her record and her track record, specifically when they're talking about legislation, and even her rhetoric is so up and down and side to side and flip and fly. I call it whiplash Warren. You break your neck trying to keep up with her policies. So that's a little bit different. But if she, like Bernie, for example, when it comes to domestic policy, he's so consistent. His rhetoric has been so consistent that whenever he doesn't necessarily get something rhetorically correct, I can look at the legislation and be like, okay, I know exactly what he means. So like, it would be a little bit more confusing. Maybe she doesn't break it down necessarily in the way that pleases everybody when it comes to her rhetoric, but the legislation, in my opinion, makes everything less. The actions make everything less confusing. I know a lot of people could talk about what they want to do and what they would do, but there's very few that have tried to implement their view of how they believe the world in this country should be ran, Tulsi being one of them. Securing America's Elections Act, Off Act with All Fossil Fuels Act. She's all about transparency, which she exemplified with her co-sponsored bill for the Consumer Protection Bureau. Like, and then obviously the terrorist legislation I was talking about. Like, if you could show me like an established pattern of her advocating for attacks and pushing for it, like even when she was quote unquote, using Islamophobic rhetoric, it wasn't even Islamophobic. The reason that she actually went out of her way to codify radical Islam as such is for the same reason that Christians in America, whenever like a Dylan Roof attacks a black church, because God told him to, and quote unquote, him being a quote unquote Christian, Christians wouldn't want him codified as a regular Christian. They want to call him a right-wing Christian extremist. So we know exactly what that is. And that's something that she, through talking to people, learn. And Muslims who are tired of being general, because that's the problem, right? We've been conditioned to believe every time we hear terrorism, even as we're having this conversation, when you talk about terrorism, we keep referring to the Middle East like that's the only type of terrorism there is. But we've been conditioned to speak, when we hear terrorism, we think Muslim. When we think of immigration, we're conditioned to think what? Mexican or South American or Central American. And she is specifically about labeling things what they are. Radical Islamic extremism is not Islam. It is not representative of the average Muslim. And so that, once again, is just, in my opinion, another example of how she listens, and then she will kind of, which is by the way, I do agree with you. I think she should, if she given the opportunity, address questions after she does her research and kind of come up with a plan for this. I just think that it hasn't really, like this, that those specific discussions haven't been brought up for anybody. So I think that's why she hasn't really talked about it. But her rhetoric, her consistency, her legislation, and on the other side of that, no pattern of being preemptive when it comes to attacking, no pattern of suggesting we should go to war with anybody. Even in her quote unquote neoliberal days, like, it makes it kind of hard for me to accept that it's confusing. I feel like if you want to dig and go deeper and deeper and deeper, then yeah, I mean, we can find something wrong with her. But at the same time, in my opinion, the evidence is overwhelming that not only is she, like I said, not only is she anti-war, but she's a strong anti-war candidate. Now, I do want to clarify that being anti-war doesn't mean being a pacifist. I'm anti-war, but I'm not a pacifist. I mean, yeah, I guess that's what I'm anti-war, but I'm not a pacifist. I understand there's a lot of evil in this world. But at the same time, when I say anti-war, I mean it. And I'm not for preemptive striking. I'm all for peace talks, which she has demonstrated. She's met with leaders in opposition in countries that we're allies with, and countries that we've had a little bit of a trepidatious relationship with. And that's what it, in my opinion, what it means to be anti-war. When you're willing to meet with the adversaries and their opposition, when you're willing to meet with the allies and their opposition in the pursuit of peace, and then when your legislation backs that, it's kind of hard to find that confusing. I feel like you offer one aspect of how she could be questioned in that regard, but all the other evidence seems to be like overwhelming in her favor.
Okay. Well, I'm willing to concede that the idea of she has not specifically said anything to my knowledge about her advocating for preemptive war. So I still stand on the position that she has not made clear why she does, like, if she doesn't believe in preemptive war, but also subscribes to the war on terror. So that is sort of still left. Someone needs to ask her and pin her down on that, I believe. But okay. One specific example I think that's really problematic that I think we should spend a little time on is this sort of back and forth. It's become almost an internal debate among Tulsi's fans, because I keep encountering sort of the same counter arguments when I bring this up, is that Tulsi did a television appearance in 2014 where the Senate torture report had just been released. And the host was sort of asking her a double question about the report being released, and also how does she feel about torture. And the problem that I had is that she doesn't seem to be responding to the report itself. Her answer seems to imply that she is actually conflicted about the idea of if torturing is okay or not. And she continues. The host actually then asked her, I forgot exactly what she asked her, but Tulsi provides an example of why she can't, in that moment, just say she completely opposes it. And the example she gives, to me, sounds like a very neoconservative sort of fear-mongering talking point about a ticking time bomb scenario, and that if there was a scenario like that, she would do everything in her power to stop an attack, and she's meaning torture in that specific example.
So she actually clarified that on the interview that my network did with her, and she also subsequently clarified it on TYT's interview with her. She said she was confused because it came out of nowhere. Like, literally, the report dropped like hours before that. And
do you have that? Huh? Do you have the clip? I mean, is it possible?
I can't run it during this particular stream because of the way it's set up. I'll send it to you though. I'll send you the interview. It's not a biggie.
Well, I just wanted to say, I mean, I think anybody who's watching us debate right now about this clip, they need to watch it for themselves, because while she is claiming now in 2019, keep in mind this clip was from 2014.
Yeah.
In her status quo interview, specifically, Jordan tells her he thought her answer was very wishy-washy. He wants to understand why she said that.
Yeah.
Her excuse was that she didn't have time to read the report. To me, that's not an answer, because it's very clear from the clip that she is saying she's conflicted about the idea of torture or not. She's not conflicted about the content of the report, or she would have said that. So I strongly believe she is not being honest in addressing this clip. And my problem is that based on the clip and her own statements, She was conflicted on torture in 2014. Where is her defining moment in regards to saying, oh my God, I was so wrong on torture, and I shifted my views since then, and now I'm unequivocally, completely opposed to torture. And I know that she has voted to vote against torture, and she has voted to ban torture, and that's what she said when asked about this, but it still doesn't explain how in only 5 years she had such a drastic turnaround. And I feel like as a politician, or even just as a person, if I was talking to you, Niko, and I was like, man, 5 years ago, I was actually conflicted about torture, and you were like, wow, you were? Like, that's crazy. I would, and you would expect me to explain why. So I feel like that's a really big thing that I'm surprised that, in my mind, a lot of people have sort of been letting her wiggle out of that and not really explain why she was still conflicted in 2014. And I think that's very troubling, and does imply her attachment to the war on terror paradigm in a way that makes me very uncomfortable.
So I hear what you say about, like, so her answer, like I said, was basically the same as was what she said on Jordan's show, which is that she was kind of confused. She legitimately didn't know if she was being asked about torture specifically, the report specifically. She hadn't even had a chance to read the report, so she gave the most general answer she could think of. Like, that's legitimately why. But once again, say I can see that she was confused and conflicted, and she shouldn't have been. As by the way, 5-6 years ago, politically, we're not even in the same ballpark. Nobody, if anybody is in the same ballpark, even from that point, unless you have time in the game, and Tulsi at that point actually did not have much time in, from especially what she was 30, 32, 33, hadn't even been in Congress for 2 years. Like, 5-6 years ago is a long time. With that being said, let's accept the fact that she was conflicted. Now, I think it's actually probably a testament more to her judgment when given the full picture, that she might have been conflicted in that moment, or she might have even been conflicted in 2014. But once she got a glimpse at the full picture, she voted against it in every way. She's been unequivocally against torture since that interview. And when she went on my show, she went on TYT, she went on Jordan's show, and she said, I'm completely went it out. And when she got the report, she was like, this is ridiculous. She's not conflicted anymore. So, like, in 2014 up until 2019, I could say in 2013, 2014, the majority of the country was homophobic. Okay. In 2012, with 2013, 2014, the majority of the country, although they were against the war in Iraq, they weren't necessarily against the war on terror because of the way it had been pitched to us.
But they were against torture, though.
They were against torture. But what I'm trying to illustrate is that it's been a huge shift of the Overton window since, and Tulsi, as consistent basically with all of her stances, once she gets some more information and once she gets the complete picture, she makes the right decisions. So, like, I agree with you. Like, I can concede, like, okay, maybe her answer wasn't clear enough. But then when her answer wasn't clear enough, when she didn't have all the details, but then when she gets all the details, she hasn't gotten it wrong since, then I would think it's the same thing on her, like the LGBTQ issue. She, even though there's not really any really crazy statements she's made, they mostly associate her with her father from when she was 21, because she was standing beside him. Literally, that's where it came from. But she might have been conflicted because of the influences around her, the information she had available. But as she gained experience in life, as she, grew as a person, she hasn't made a misstep since taking office, at least legislatively or with her vote. And that's, in matter of fact, she's even gone out of her way to introduce legislation that actually makes LGBTQ community a protected class under the Civil Rights Amendments. So, like, I'm more concerned with whether or not, once you get all the information, can you get it right? And it seems to me that when she gets all the information, obviously as a president, you're going to get all the information. She does get it right. So what would be your rebuttal to that idea that, like, people can change, people can be conflicted at one point, and then, but if the way they affect politics is the right way, then how can we really hold that against them unless they show, once again, a pattern that has been established of being conflicted even in their votes?
Well, I would argue there is a pattern of her changing her views in really, in my opinion, drastic ways without explanation. On this in particular, you have just told me that after she got the information, after they got the report and she was corrected, she came down on the right side in this particular issue. I don't know that because I haven't seen her say that. I would like to see a statement from her explaining why in the last 5 years or after getting the report, she did a complete about-face turnaround on torture. I have not seen any evidence of that. But the example you brought up is a good one, I think, of the LGBTQ thing, because she actually did release a statement. She did release a pretty lengthy statement explaining in detail why she used to hold the views that she thinks are wrong now and why she changed. She hasn't done anything close to that, in my opinion, with torture, which I would argue is a really big issue to change on in a 5-year time span. So I feel like, you know, as good of a job as you have done, Jimmy Dore has done interviewing her, who else? Jordan Cheriton, Primo Nutmeg. Nobody actually asked her the specific thing that I just brought up here, is that she was clearly answering as if she was conflicted about torture herself. And what actually changed her mind? Why was she conflicted? And why is she now not conflicted? I need an answer for that to feel comfortable with that turnaround. That's a pretty big, you know, to me, that's a pretty big thing to change your views on. And you know, the Overton window thing, you know, when you look at that era, 2014, that's 6 years out of the Bush era. This is, we're already 2 years away from the end of the Obama presidency. Most American people, even generic Republicans, knew to stop saying that they supported waterboarding and torture. Like, it was pretty clear at that time period that was a no-no. It was kind of, and I'm not saying that, you know, all those people were legitimate or genuine. I'm sure some of them really did still want to torture, like some of the hawkish Republicans. But I feel that most people, at least in 2014, most generic politicians could read the room and know that being conflicted on torture looks really bad. And that's also surprises me, is that I'm surprised she wasn't even just able to read the room in that instance. And even when the host gave her sort of an off ramp and said, well, people even say that it's ineffective, you know, so like, why do we even do it? And she's like, well, there are people who actually do say it's effective. It's like, wow. I mean, that, to me, that's a kind of a shocking response. And, you know, maybe that speaks to her sort of independence. You know, that's something that people praise her for, is that she doesn't think like other politicians. But at the same time, like, everything I've just said, it is still very alarming to me. And I do strongly feel that someone needs to pin her down on this, because, you know, torture to me is you know, it's a deal breaker kind of an issue, even if you're voting the right way now. And only 5 years ago, you held views, in my opinion, that extreme. So there's something that needs to be explained there.
So I would say this. I believe that explanations and transparency is ultimately always good. Now, I do want to say that, you know, in my personal opinion, you're setting the bar kind of really high, like to the point where if legislation doesn't really move you, like the consistency of legislation and the lack of patterns that kind of substantiate the idea that she may be pro-torture, like the legislation is there, the votes are there, that one statement is what you're basing, it seems to be, your entire analysis on her position on torture on, and the legislation and her votes strongly outweigh that. I think the bar is kind of high. And I feel like maybe because you think that she might be a great candidate, so you're setting the bar high because you don't want to be ultimately let down. Completely understand that. But I do think that this is someone who, for example, in 2014, if you would have asked me, would you vote for anybody that accepts PAC money, knowing what I know, or super PAC money, or corporate money, or, you know, money from Lockheed Martin and Boeing and all of them, I'd have been like, no. But she took money in 2014, I think from the military industrial complex. At the very bare minimum, she took corporate PAC money. And now she does not. She hasn't issued an apology. She hasn't told us why. She just says, I don't take it anymore. I know what it does. I know how it influences. I'm not taking it. And she has the most progressive platform in that regard as well. But we don't really ask her for an apology for ever taking it. Why? Because once you've established a pattern that is completely contrary to whatever, you know, you may have been known for in the past, even when it comes, Bernie and Tulsi both were trash in the Israel-Palestine issue. They were both trash on it, like to the point where I was appalled by both of them when I went back and looked at some of the votes that they put out and then some of the things that they had said. They both gotten way better at it. Tulsi specifically actually went after Trump for trying to give Israel Golan Heights. And so she's gotten much, much better at it. And she's even actually given reason as to why she kind of felt the way she used to feel about it, because, you know, that emotional appeal from visiting Auschwitz and all that good stuff. Now, once again, I don't really apologize. I don't really expect her to apologize for an evolution, if that makes sense. She apologized for the LGBTQ thing, I think, because that's kind of an issue that is very personal for a lot of people, for everybody, everywhere, because if somebody deals with this, either it's themselves or their friends, and that wasn't really an apology because she didn't vote wrong at all whatsoever, but more of an apology for not being self-aware enough to evolve earlier on in her life. I don't think that's the same thing as politics. I think that's like a personal apology from her personal perspective. But once again, and when it comes to other things, when we're talking about legislation, I'm just very much so behind patterns of consistency when it comes to action. Like maybe we're different in this regard. Rhetoric is very important to me. Don't get me wrong, but Bernie, talks about, and don't get me wrong, I love Bernie still, but at the end of the day, he talked about free press and how Trump attacks the press and press. Julian Assange gets arrested out of the embassy. He says nothing. So did he follow up with that with action? No, it was just rhetoric at that point. Trump said he was going to be anti-war. You and I both know how that turned out. Even when he was consistent on his pattern of rhetoric for anti-war, he was still not anti-war when it came to his actions. So I think that it's very difficult for me to be to kind of even have the same level of skepticism that you have. And you have it from, like I said, you have it from a legitimate perspective. There are neoliberals who are just quoting a bunch of stuff they heard on MSNBC and CNN that has been debunked dozens of times. Your issue seems to be with rhetoric in very specific instances. And all I can say is that I'm sure that if I go through your tweets from 3-4 days ago, you probably said something, you're like, I don't really feel like that. I felt like that at the time, but I've kind of changed my tune since then. And you didn't write another tweet apologizing for it, and I didn't require you to apologize for it before I could take you seriously as a progressive. And I feel like that's like kind of the same thing. We've said things, but what do our patterns demonstrate? What do our actions demonstrate? And I think that's where Tulsi has separated herself from the pack, and which is why she gained the endorsement. I mean, when Mike Gravel endorsed her, it's kind of like, oh shit, like that's a pretty big deal considering Mike Gravel's history. Ron Paul came out, same thing. Oliver Stone came out, same thing. Jill Stein came out, same thing. And so you're starting to see this pattern. Like, hold on, I understand why people may be a little skeptical, because it's almost like she's too good to be true in some aspects. But like all the anti-war people came out and endorsed her. So like,
well, technically, Ron Paul didn't literally endorse her. He just said he really liked her and liked a lot of the things she was. Daniel McAdams, his co-host, had to come out and say that was not an endorsement. So you said a lot of things there. So let me go back to the idea of, is it acceptable that you didn't offer some kind of apology or explanation? I'm not expecting her to apologize for coming out on TV and saying she was conflicted about torture, but for me, it really, really does deserve some kind of explanation, because if you're presenting yourself as an anti-war candidate, and that's sort of how you're defining your candidacy, something like being conflicted on torture only 5 years ago, to me, really does not line up with that. So I want to know how she got from that point to where she is now. And to me, it is really important. I'm not.
I think it was deployment. I can't speak for her, to be honest with you, but I think it might have been deployment. Like, to be completely honest with you, that's what she's used to talk about.
Yeah.
Because that's basically the whole reason that she became staunchly anti-war was because of her deployment.
Yeah, I mean, and I know many veterans who are much stronger opposed to the war on terror than she is. I mean, there's all kinds of things that the military can twist you into believing. I'd still like to see her explain that. I mean, I think it's really important that she does, and I was hoping that Greenwald would be the one to finally press her on that. And he actually told me in a Twitter exchange he was going to, and it wasn't in the interview that he released. So I was disappointed by that. But I understand where you stand. I think we've established where I stand on this. I think that she desperately needs to explain that.
I don't disagree. Like I said, I if when it comes to asking for somebody so when it comes to asking for someone to explain something, I will never say you're wrong on that, because I think that if we feel like she hasn't clarified something, if she's going to be the bold leader that we will honestly need going into 2020, then I think that she should explain as much as humanly possible. And that's something that she's actually been going out of her way to work on. In fact, I think she explains herself more than any other candidate when she puts herself out there in these videos pretty consistently and pretty regularly, making it known where she stands very early on. Now, my only issue, and I would like to know how you feel about that, is like when we say, well, I don't know how I feel about her as an anti-war candidate unless she explains these three things. Like, and if once again the pattern hadn't been established, then I'd be a little bit more kind of like in the camp of, yeah, she needs to address this first. But like a pattern has been established, and I feel like it's unfair to say, well, we don't know if she's anti-war really until she explains this particular rhetoric, even though her legislation and her voting says something completely different. Like, do you think that that's like maybe an unfair standard to say if she doesn't do this, then she's not this?
Well, I think if that was the only thing, then yeah, you could argue that would be unfair or holding too high of a bar. I mean, but there are definitely other things that show that, while you're talking about this pattern now, and she does, I would agree, have a consistent pattern fairly recently voting on these things in a way that I agree with. However, in the very recent past, she actually voted in ways that went to the right of Obama on foreign policy in several areas. So, I mean, it's not just the fact that she was conflicted on torture in 2014. It's that there hasn't been an explanation for a lot of her turnaround on a lot of these things. So, for example, she's out there right now talking about Cold War 2.0, the new Cold War, the danger of escalating tensions with Russia. Mm-hmm. However, she did vote to send offensive weaponry to Ukraine, something that one of the only...
Hold up. When was that vote, though?
I don't have the date.
Like 2014, 2015.
I believe it was 2015. So yeah. It was a while ago. However, this is something that Obama, to his credit, actually held out and did not do. Of course,
which is kind of crazy, by the way, because he definitely sent like $50 billion, like of U.S. Like he spent like $50 billion worth of U.S. military to Eastern Europe, which is weird.
It's totally weird. I mean, that was arguably one of the biggest like Cold War Russia escalations we've had since like the end of the actual Cold War. I mean, they were real. I mean, that was a really big deal. So you're right. That is weird that he drew the line there. But in a way that, I mean, that, probably contained the situation to some degree. I don't know why she voted to send offensive weaponry to Ukraine. Maybe there's a statement she made on the House floor about that. But the other thing,
she got it wrong. She got it wrong. And like that's just a fact of it. She got it wrong. And I would say that, and this is a personal conversation that I've had that she allowed me to tell people about, so I don't mind talking about it. I asked her basically what has changed about like the way she used to be, the way she saw the issues, basically from up until this point now. And you can accept it for what it is. I know like there's not a video on or anything like that, but she literally said that basically peeling back the layers of lies to try and get close to the truth, kind of it allowed her to see just how corrupt the system really is. She figured out about the lies we were talking about, overseas, the lies that had been told when it comes to the Middle East, even when it came to Eastern Europe and things like that. And so it's helped her transition into, I mean, she was even, I strongly encourage you to go watch the Joe Rogan interview. She is educating Joe Rogan on like historical attempts to manufacture consent for war, because this is stuff she's been recently learning about within the last 3 to 4 years, much like myself. Like I thought I knew a lot and I turned out I didn't know a damn thing. And I think that she's kind of representative of that. People who are waking up now to a level of like, to such a level of discomfort that they feel like they have to do something about it. I'm sure that it would probably benefit her more so to just ride the wave with Bernie and then try to run after him. But I don't think that, I think that it's such a level of desperation because she really sees what the world is and what it would take to fix a lot of the problems that we have today, that she just could not wait. And I think that that's kind of like I said, the conversation that we had, albeit like I said, it wasn't official, but it was just something that, because I was kind of in the same boat as you. This was before I had endorsed her. I was kind of like, yo, you made a huge transition. Like, what the hell happened, basically? And when she explained it to me, it kind of like, it all made sense.
Well, that's great that you had the opportunity to talk with her and have that conversation. I want to see her have that conversation in a sort of a public forum, whether a public interview or something, because I would very much like to understand that transition and have her speak to her, potential voters about why that is. I mean, I think that would be really valuable, honestly, for her campaign, especially for convincing people like me. But I realize we don't have that much time left. So I guess the other thing I wanted to emphasize is that I do very much disagree with her framing about radical Islamic terrorism being the main reason for terror. Or sorry, she has actually said on record that radical Islamic ideology is the source of the most threatening and dangerous terrorism against the United States.
Okay.
And she used to say that in a more broad sense, but she now specifies that she means Wahhabism exported from Saudi Arabia, Salafist ideology. So she's gotten a little more specific about what she means.
Mm-hmm.
I felt in the past it was a little too close to a Sam Harris way of discussing Islamic terrorism.
Yes.
But I wanted to point to what we understand as what typically an anti-war platform is, and how strongly that differs from what we've heard from other candidates in the past. So here's Kucinich in 2008. He says, the roots of terrorism lie in desperation. People with no hope resort to acts of indiscriminate violence. People with futures don't typically strap on bombs to kill others. We must refrain from condoning some acts of violence as justified, while similar actions by others are dismissed as, quote, terrorism. He goes on to say that, here's a quote from Ron Paul, who's to the right of Tulsi Gabbard on many issues, not a progressive by any stretch of the imagination. He says, we have to understand the motives of those who come here to kill us. If we don't understand that, we are not going to win that fight. They come here to kill us because we occupy their lands, and they rationally reason that we have to do something about it. And then he also says, Bin Laden's claims are straightforward. The U.S. defies Islam with military bases on Holy Land in Saudi Arabia. Its initiation of war against Iraq and its dollars and weapons being used against the Palestinians as the Palestinian territory shrinks and Israel's occupation expands. There will be no peace for the next 50 years or longer if we refuse to believe why those who are attacking us are doing it. And I wanted to read those quotes because I think they stand in stark contrast to the way that anti-war candidate Tulsi Gabbard discusses terrorism now. And, whether you agree with the way she discusses terrorism now, I think it just shows how different the rhetoric is, and also not just the rhetoric, but the worldview, because I think we are different. We are dealing with potentially her having a very different worldview in some pretty big ways from people like Ron Paul and Dennis Kucinich and even Mike Gravel. And I think a lot of people are essentially, thinking that she's all in that camp with them. But I think when you really read their rhetoric and their platforms, especially on terrorism, she is very different. And I guess that's the final point I wanted.
Okay. So which is a very reasonable point to make. I would say that I agree with the codification. It is different, right? I don't think it's necessarily bad. I think it is another way. And matter of fact, I think it's actually a useful way, in an effective way to put a quote unquote face, right? To get an emotional response, because at the end of the day, and I hate to be so blunt about this, but most Americans don't really care about people dying overseas. It's sad, it's unfortunate, but it's reality. And of course, once again, we've been conditioned, and the U.S. government has really dehumanized basically anyone who doesn't look like us or speak like us or have the same culture as us. So the way that that she likely feels, and I actually kind of agree with her, is that, yeah, you can take the Dennis Kucinich approach, and that approach would be good, or the Ron Paul approach. But why not educate Americans on the fact that the people who are currently in power are paying for all the problems that Dennis Kucinich and Ron Paul speak to? Because you can make general statements about what terrorism is, right? And I agree with them, right? It's like the whole metaphor about Star Wars, about the rebels versus the Empire. That's all fact. But until you start putting names, associations that people can make emotional connections to, that really have actionable what's the word I'm looking for? Actual calls to action, basically. Like, we can speak generally, but that doesn't say Trump is assisting and funding Saudi Arabia, funding terrorism. That is a threat that spends our dollar, that causes our dollars to be spent here, that XYZ, and then build that logical tree up so that people can kind of have a logical chain to follow to say this guy's a problem or this person's a problem, and that's why we need to be taken care of. So, like, although I agree with you, her rhetoric is different. I think that that's the best way to codify. It is just different. And in my opinion, it could potentially be more efficacious in the long term because now they have names and association. And now more of the country is being woken up to the fact that Saudi Arabia is being funded in a lot of ways by the U.S. to fund terrorism. People are finding out Saudi Arabia is involved in way more things at the behest of the United States, and vice versa, right? We're involved in a lot of things at the behest of Saudi Arabia, and so now we have kind of a name or a being to associate that with. It actually kind of gives people, which in my opinion, people inherently kind of need something to point to in order for them to feel like they can beat it. It gives them, I don't want to say an enemy, but it gives them a target. And when people have a target, they can organize and discuss how to defeat that target. But when it's very abstract, it's hard for people, especially Americans, because we're kind of raised in a very Hegelian A or B or C, where things have to be categorized in a very specific way. It's hard for Americans to coalesce and be galvanized around an abstract idea, which was what was kind of hard about the war on terror to begin with, right? People kind of like, it's really kind of, that's why they had to say weapons of mass destruction, because they needed a target, right? They had to keep saying Saddam's name. Same thing when it came to Afghanistan. Somehow we associate with what's his name, Osama bin Laden, with Afghanistan. He has nothing to do with Afghanistan. He's Saudi Arabia, but they had a target. So Tulsi, understanding how people think, she also understands people need a target. Saudi Arabia is a target. Trump is a target. This administration even is a target, and explaining how their actions lead to terrorism, lead to terrorist groups, and lead to those threats. In my opinion, like I said, is different, but it could potentially end up being more efficacious when it comes to achieving the goals that you and I both agree on, which is to stop funding and arming of terrorism and using those resources, of course, to fund progressive domestic policies.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that she. I mean, even as recently as the TYT Cenk Uygur interview, she was asked to clarify her statements, saying that she believed radical Islam was the main fuel of terrorism. She doubled down on it and said she still believes that. She additionally,
Wahhabism, though, she was very specific about the Wahhabism part.
Now, but here's the thing that interests me about that is she is claiming now that is what she's always meant. But if you watch a lot of her old video clips talking about it, she never mentions Wahhabism specifically. So
I think back then, in all fairness, most people would have no idea what the hell Wahhabism is. And to be completely honest with you, I don't think she knew necessarily how to codify the specific, like, I don't know what you call it, extremism, or the I don't know what you would call Saudi Arabia other than Wahhabism, but basically extreme nature and like what to name that extreme nature of Islam in Saudi Arabia. So, like, unless she had talked about it at length and learned about it, I'm pretty sure she just didn't know what to codify it as, because Wahhabism isn't something that's been discussed in general dialogue. It's been discussed in academia, but it hasn't been discussed in general dialogue at a normalized level until very recently, like within the last 3 to 4 years, if that. So
yeah, I mean, it's possible that she figured out a way to hone that more specifically. I don't know why her rhetoric changed on that and why she's saying she always meant Wahhabism. Perhaps she's sincere. I don't know that for sure. I don't know if she's trying to rewrite a little bit or sort of trying to massage the old interviews she's done to make it sound like.
I think it's like what you claim she needs to do. She should be more specific when she's making certain claims. I think that's probably what she aimed to do.
Well, and so back to the point I was trying to make, that I think that if she stuck to the idea that our money that funds Saudi Arabia and Saudi's money is helping fuel, terrorist attacks across the country, that would be, I would find that or not across the country, but across the world. I would find that an acceptable paradigm. But she is still primarily going out there when asked about this, that she believes the radical ideology itself is the fuel for terrorism. She does not believe our foreign policy. She has not gone out of her way to say our foreign policy, our drone strikes create more terrorists.
No, she has said that. She has. She said she's definitely said that. In fact, she makes that argument pretty often when she says these regime change wars, drone strikes, and things like that are what specifically endangers our national security. That's the specific context that she frames it in. So I just want to clarify that. Like, that's definitely something she says. She might be not specific on some other stuff, but that is something she makes a pretty good habit of mentioning.
Okay, well, please post the clip if you can after.
No problem.
I haven't seen anything like that. I mean, and just for the record, just so people know, like, I couldn't find every conceivable statement that she's made and, make absolutely sure that I know everything she said. I mean, so there's definitely things that I could have missed that she said she's come out stronger against terrorism. I don't know about it.
It's a lot to keep up with. She has a lot of content out there now. So
she does. Yeah. And, and there's definitely two tracks of this. There is her rhetoric and her voting record, which, kind of tell different stories. And I think that, you kind of almost need to assess them individually. But I ultimately agree with you that the voting is more important than the rhetoric, but I still find a lot of the rhetoric highly problematic in some areas, and it needs a lot more explanation.
Okay. Yeah. Well, like I said, I'm never going to be against explanations. Like, I always feel like more transparency is better. And I hope that, her and her staff is watching this, so maybe they can address some of it. I do, like I said, personally, I do feel like the voting is kind of like, it's kind of way so far ahead of the game. Her rhetoric, when she has time to kind of sit down and address an issue. Now, like, I like to keep in the context, like, I've been a part of a presidential campaign before. I've been like, I'm close enough as press to this campaign where I've seen them and been beside them while they're prepping and things like that. She can't address literally everything that people would want her to address with videos and things like that. She usually addresses things as they come up or as they're asked to her. But I would like, because there are people like you who may be on the fence and are waiting to find something that kind of like, okay, that's it, I'm going to vote for her. For some people, it was Assange. For you, it seems to be clarification on the radical Islamic extremism comments and torture, which is perfectly fine. But I do maintain, of course, that, like I said, I'm actions. I'm really, because I've seen a lot of people right now, like in the progressive media world, they swear to God they're so progressive, and I'm like, but you like Elizabeth Warren, Miss Green Bombs. So, but I appreciate the spirited discussion, man. I really do. I think the audience really appreciates it as well. I thank you, because oftentimes most people say the most outlandish shit, especially about Tulsi, sometimes about other people, but it's about Tulsi recently. And they're on the left, and I asked them to come on, or I can go on their show and we can have this same type of discussion, like very civil, an educated discussion based off the facts. And nobody else wanted to do it except for you. So I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on, man. Yeah, I appreciate you giving me the platform to hash it out and voice our disagreements and all that.
No problem at all, man. Let people know where they can find you at.
You can find me on Twitter. My more sort of I say the most unfiltered stuff on Twitter at Fluorescent Gray. I do a podcast with my sister every week called Media Roots Radio. You can find it on SoundCloud, iTunes, all the different platforms. And I'll be doing live streams of my own. I've started doing them, but I've just started to sort of ramp them up now on a very heavy agenda YouTube channel, which is linked on my Twitter page.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Thanks for coming on. Thanks everybody for tuning in. If you are just now tuning in, you're just gonna have to watch the replay. It'll be up in a second. And make sure you check out the video we did earlier talking about the DNC raising the bar for the third debates. Also about this nonsensical idea that somehow Elizabeth Warren is going to take progressive votes from Bernie Sanders. Yeah, that's ridiculous. I know, but go watch it anyway. With that being said, people, always remember, more than anything else, find your balance. Peace.